face-to-face, what you get is the shuffling of chairs and the chat amongst people, and I miss that slightly with these online things. But it's great to have the chance to still be able to do these kind of interactive sessions. So thank you very much for joining this joint webinar on nature and climate crisis. I'm Anne McCall. I'm the director of RSPB Scotland, and very pleased to be hosting this. This is the, I think, 7th in a series of webinars that have been brought together by Stop Climate Chaos Scotland and their members. And the aim of the seminars is to look at some of the key issues that are essential to tackling the climate emergency, and also to help us all better understand the kinds of issues likely to be considered at COP26 in November. I should let you know that we are recording this session. It's also live streaming on Facebook. It will be available on the Climate Fringe website as a recording after the event. And for those who might not yet be aware of the Climate Fringe, it's a fantastic resource. It's providing a home for events of all kinds in the run-up to COP26. And I'd really encourage you to check it out. You'll be able to see recordings of previous webinars. There's also podcasts. You can also find out details of a really huge and fascinating range of future events. There are workshops and training opportunities and talks going on across Scotland and, in fact, well beyond Scotland. In terms of housekeeping, I'm going to assume quite a lot of you may have taken part in these kinds of sessions before, but if you haven't, or by way of a bit of a reminder, everyone other than the speakers will be automatically muted. There's a live transcription option if you'd like to use that, which I'm not sure if it's coming up automatically for people, but there's a little CC live transcript button, which will allow you to see it if it's not. I'm very grateful to Tammy from Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, who's going to be acting as our power behind the technology today. Also, in terms of the throughout the session, if you could use the chat button to ask any questions or make reflections or observations or share interesting links, that would be great. Tammy's going to be monitoring the questions, so please just put them up as they occur to you. We'll also try and monitor the Facebook live feed, see if there's any questions coming in from there. And then I will introduce and we'll hear from each of our 3 speakers in turn. And once we've heard from all of the speakers, we'll take the opportunity to pick up on the questions or any of the queries or issues that you've raised. But before I do that, I thought I'd shamelessly take the opportunity to make a few quick opening remarks. As I hope many of you know, 2021 marks the beginning of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. It's an incredibly crucial decade for our planet, and this year is particularly important for the big global frameworks that are set through both the CBD on biodiversity at COP15 and the UNFCCC on climate at COP26. And while those COPs might be split into 2 separate events, there is, I think, thankfully, a growing acknowledgement and recognition that healthy ecosystems and biodiversity play a really crucial role in tackling the climate crisis. Or, you know, to place the emphasis slightly differently, we know that nature is in crisis and needs saving. And in doing so, there are huge benefits for the climate. So we know that healthy ecosystems are vitally important for our wildlife, but they're also important for effective carbon storage, and also for protecting people from the impacts of climate change. They can help us to adapt to climate change because healthy ecosystems underpin our natural support mechanisms like natural floodplain management. And they also contribute to healthy people and communities. And I suspect at the moment the importance of nature for our mental health and well-being has never felt as critical as it does right now. So as a result of the very close link between nature and climate, the language of nature-based solutions is really gaining traction, and that's a move many of us really welcome. But when it loses sight of some values, for example, equity, nature-based solutions can pose risks as well as benefits. And some examples of that include using them as a form of greenwashing, as an excuse for land grabs, or as a substitute for decarbonising our economy. And I think as a society, it's incredibly important we don't squander this opportunity or use it badly. Nature-based solutions can, and in many cases already have demonstrated that they can deliver for nature and climate, but they can't be used as a reason to defer ambitious cuts to greenhouse gas emissions or to cover for investments that lock in high carbon resources, nor as an excuse to lift environmental protections. It's really important that nature-based activities be complemented by emissions reductions at source, by comprehensive climate policies and proper accountability. And I know our speakers today will touch on many of these aspects and more, as well as talking about at least one example from RSPB Scotland's nature reserve at Barons Haugh. And it's that focus for me really on good real world examples that I think is key, because we've got a lot of them in Scotland, and in many cases they're the output of work that's been in place for many years. One of the examples I'm most familiar with is the restoration of our peatland habitats, which as an organisation we've been working on with the Peatland Partnership in the Flow Country since the 1990s on a very practical level, and since the 1980s in the policy world. Another really great example is the more recent Cairngorms Connect project, which covers 60,000 hectares of land, multiple landowners, communities, and a 200-year vision for habitat restoration, including peatland, woodland, and floodplains. And some of these projects obviously predated the concept of nature-based solutions, but that's exactly what they are. And it's only relatively recently, I think, that we've come to fully appreciate the significant contribution they can make towards tackling climate change. So we've got a fantastic opportunity to develop more great examples, but obviously we need to make sure they're done well. So this webinar, I think, is a really great chance to explore both the vulnerability and the potential of natural ecosystems in relation to tackling climate change. And I'm hoping we can explore a few sort of core things, introducing the role nature can play in addressing the climate crisis, including the risks and safeguards, raise the profile of the nature crisis, which is still frequently forgotten or overlooked. I'm also hoping that we can highlight that the solutions for the climate crisis should also work as solutions for the nature crisis, because to fix one while permanently damaging the other would be folly. Also to explore the role for individuals and communities with nature-based solutions, and to highlight at least one project which we're working on at the moment with a wetland regeneration plan at Barons Haugh. So thank you for your patience and your indulgence for my introductory remarks. I hope that's helped set the scene a little bit for the rest of our session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Mel is the Principal Policy Officer covering climate at the RSPB. She's been with RSPB for 17 years. She leads on climate change policy work, but her present focus is on nature's role in helping meet UK and global climate targets. And she also coordinates national and international NGOs working to influence the role of ecosystems in the UN climate negotiations. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Mel, who's going to be looking at nature-based solutions, what they are, and the importance of getting them right. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Anne, and good morning, everybody. Really great to be here to have this conversation with you today. Let me just start by sharing my screen so that you can see my presentation. There we go. Hopefully you can see that now in front of you. So yes, as Anne said, I'm going to talk to you about what nature-based solutions are and the importance of getting them right. And I'll just say quickly how I'm going to structure the talk. So I'm going to take quite an introductory look at what nature-based solutions are, but then look in a bit more detail at the types of habitats that can provide those solutions. I'm then going to explore this idea that Anne has introduced of the importance of getting nature-based solutions right and avoiding kind of pitfalls in their implementation. And then please do start thinking about any questions that you have as we go through. I think we'll be taking questions after all the speakers have presented. So in my mind, and perhaps in many of yours, nature has intrinsic value. But we know that nature can also help us tackle some of society's greatest challenges. And among those, of course, in this climate change focus seminar, climate change is one of the most significant. And so this brings us on to kind of the way that nature-based solutions is defined. So it is nature's role in providing solutions to those challenges, whether they're environmental challenges like climate change or social challenges or indeed economic ones. And it's important to be clear on the kind of language that we're using, I think. So nature-based solutions are not just another term for nature conservation. We have a very deep and worrying biodiversity crisis. Every time WWF produces one of its Living Planet reports shows us just quite how significant that is. And we know from the global scientific body that we need to do everything we can to stop the biodiversity crisis. So we need nature conservation. But this idea of focusing on some of the solutions that nature can provide for us provides yet another reason to protect and invest in nature. And you know, we know from the scientific bodies who are working on climate change, the IPCC, and the scientific bodies working on biodiversity, which is the IPBES, we know from both of those and from the great body of scientific evidence that these two crises are intrinsically linked. We cannot solve the nature crisis if we don't address climate change. We cannot solve the climate crisis if we don't take into account the role that natural ecosystems play. So as Anne alluded to, there are a great variety of benefits that nature can provide for us. And although we will in this talk be focusing principally on carbon sequestration and to a certain extent on climate change adaptation, I think, you know, you can see just from this slide the array of benefits that nature brings. And it's so critical to the conversation at this time as we're trying to work out as a society and as a world how we recover from COVID, to think about this role that nature can play, because it's really important that we invest in it for the green recovery that we want to see. So where are these places? So RSPB undertook a really interesting piece of work looking at where high nature value, high carbon places are in the UK, and we mapped them. And you can see on the left-hand side, those green areas are areas of high wildlife value. And on the right-hand side, those red areas are areas of high carbon value. So looking at the carbon in the vegetation in the top 30 centimeters of the soil. And what is instantly striking about those maps is the entire degree of overlap between them. So you can see the areas that are rich in nature are also very, very important carbon stores. Also interesting to note just what a prominent role that the Scotland plays in this. You know, it's actually principally the peat bog habitats that are so important in Scotland, but Scotland has a really, really important role to play in these nature-based solutions. So we know that ecosystems lock up carbon, but how much? So our mapping work explored this and found that around 2 gigatons of carbon, which sounds like a big number, kind of hard to imagine, but that's equivalent to 4 years of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions. So very, very significant. So I'm going to come on and look at the different types of habitats that we're particularly focusing on that were represented in those maps. So woodlands are perhaps the most well understood and most kind of prominent in the discussion around nature-based solutions. It's really important when we think about trees to think about protecting what we have, first of all, that really offers a lot of value. So protecting ancient and semi-natural woodlands. There's a huge political discussion around new woodlands. And I don't know how it's been with the Scottish government, but I'm based in England, but with the Westminster government, there was a real fight between all the parties in their manifestos, who could plant the most trees. You know, tree planting targets became a very political thing. But it's really essential for both nature and the climate that we plant the right trees in the right place. And so just explore quickly what that means. So if we plant trees on peat, for example, actually you don't get the carbon benefit that you would from a new woodland, because you're disturbing those peatland soils and you're releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. Equally, if you're planting trees on areas that are already really important for wildlife, then you're defeating the kind of nature benefits that you could get from the tree planting. So really important to think about the right tree in the right place. Then we saw from those maps that actually some of the areas that are most important for carbon are peat bog areas. These are huge carbon stores, but unfortunately our peatlands are not in good condition. And although I'm delighted that Muirburn has stopped recently in Scotland, in England we are still burning our peatlands. They're heavily degraded, they're drained, they're impacted by recreation. But actually at the moment, they're a source of 5% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. And we really need to turn off that emission source, restore those peat bogs for their wildlife value, but also as critical carbon sinks. Coming on to coastal wetlands, these are less kind of well known as a potential nature-based solution, but what I was fascinated to find out was that salt marshes actually suck up carbon between 2 and 4 times faster than tropical rainforests, which is amazing. So although they don't cover a huge area, they are very important for climate change mitigation. They're also probably better known for their role in climate change adaptation, and as with increasing climate change, we see sea level rise, we see increased storminess. They're really important in protecting and buffering our coasts against those impacts. They're also hugely important for wildlife, and we're a bird organisation. They're incredibly important for birds, migrating and native birds. And we have hundreds of thousands on our shores, some of them which are globally important. And finally, coming to meadows and permanent grasslands. So although these actually have significantly lower carbon stored in them, the amount stored in the soil is still significant, and they cover a very wide area, and they can also be incredibly rich in wildlife. The one that I haven't touched on that wasn't explored in our mapping was what's off our coasts. So we have marine kelp beds, we have seagrass beds, and the emerging science is showing that these also have a really important role to play, and their protection is essential. And we'll be really interested to see more of the kind of science and evidence coming around the role that they can play. So I'm delighted that Anne teed up this slide. This is a picture of the Cairngorms area. You can see their snowy peaks in the background. And I also wanted to talk about the Cairngorms Connect project. Do go and Google it and look up and see their incredibly inspiring video. The long-term vision, which as Anne said is 200 years, the fact that this is a really large landscape scale project involving a huge number of diverse actors is really inspiring, and a real opportunity to see how it's kind of woodland restoration, peat bog management, floodplain restoration can really deliver for nature, people and climate. So really exciting one. So how do we make sure that we get these really sort of multi-benefit outcomes and we get nature-based solutions right? Well, I just want to reflect on how important this is, because I was at COP25. So we're coming up to COP26 in Glasgow. COP25 was in Madrid. There was a lot of interest in nature-based solutions, much more than there had ever been at previous COPs. But there were also some kind of worrying signs that some actors were seeking to use this as greenwashing. So we were seeing the likes of Shell and BP come forward and talk about continuing essentially their business as usual practices whilst investing in tree planting schemes. And the quality of those tree planting schemes, obviously we don't know, but large scale tree planting schemes, as I alluded to, can be really damaging. So it's incredibly important that we get nature-based solutions right. And it was that experience really that led the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at Oxford University to come together with other academic organisations and with ourselves and other NGOs. And you can see there's an array of logos there to come up with some real guiding principles for how to do nature-based solutions well. And we put these in a letter to Alok Sharma, COP26 president, and he received these on his very first day in office. And we've been using these as our guiding principles ever since, and they've really taken off. And actually, Christiana Figueres, the UN climate chief, has been promoting them. Some businesses have been talking about them, and they are generally pretty widely accepted. And I've included this website here because you can scribble it down, nbsguidelines.info, and go and have a look at those principles in detail. It's just one letter, so it's quite straightforward. But I'm now going to talk you through the headlines now. So the first one, and Anne highlighted just how important this is that any investment in the role that nature plays in climate change mitigation must be additional to those critical fossil fuel reductions if we to stand a chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. We can't use it just to offset business as usual emissions from the likes of the oil industry. So that's really, really important, and we have to decarbonise rapidly, as well as invest in the role that nature can play. The second one relates to my point about how political tree planting is and how much attention tends to focus on that. It's so important that we move beyond just focusing on, on the role that trees can play, Sorry, frog in my throat. And look beyond trees to those peatlands, those coastal wetlands, those permanent grasslands, and those habitats off our shores and the role that they can play too. The third, I think, is really exemplified by the two little insert pictures that you can see there on your screen. So it's possible to see really clearly, just instantly, the difference between a Scottish bluebell woodland and some industrial forestry plantation. So the bottom image I took on my holiday in Arran last year. And whilst Arran is an absolutely beautiful island, I was really struck by just how barren and devoid of any life these kind of forestry plantations are. So when we're looking in investing in trees, you can see very clearly there the different role that forests can play and the importance of investing in biodiversity-rich ecosystems. And finally, a super important point, and one that I'm excited that Alex is going to be talking to you about in a lot more detail in the next presentation, is the importance of bringing people with us in this. So in the global context, actually, the people who are, some of the people who are most important but often get left out of the conversation are Indigenous peoples, who play a very important stewardship role. Within the UK context, obviously, farmers, local communities, landowners, all are people who we need to bring with us as we seek to look at the role that nature-based solutions can play. So I'm just going to conclude very briefly. We know nature has value in and of itself, but we're facing some incredible challenges right now. We're facing an ecological crisis. We're facing a climate crisis. With COVID, we're facing a health crisis. And that health crisis has led to a really significant financial crisis, putting vulnerable people on the front line. And there is a solution that can really help us tackle all of these. And that solution is nature. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Melanie. Perfectly to time. It gives me great pleasure now to hand over to our second speaker, who is Alex Chausson from the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at the University of Oxford. Alex has been conducting and applying social and ecological research over the past 7 years, focusing on environmental conservation and now nature-based solutions. At the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, he manages research and knowledge exchange projects focusing on nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. And as Mel mentioned, he's going to be discussing the role of local people and communities in fostering successful nature-based solutions. So welcome, Alex.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see that. Thank you. Well, first and foremost, thank you to Loti and for inviting me to speak today, and to Anne and RSPB Scotland for pulling together this wonderful event with Climate Fringe. So yes, I'm based at the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. My background is in conservation science. And I look at nature-based solutions through an interdisciplinary lens. I was asked to talk to you today about the role of local people and communities. And I'm going to take more of a global focus, but I will ground what I'm saying in specific case studies. And then I think David's presentation will bring home some of those points back to the reality on the ground in Scotland. So I'm just going to go through this quickly because it's been already mentioned, but as this slide on the top right from Kate Raworth highlights, the 21st century is really marked by a set of challenges, which we refer to commonly as wicked problems. Yes, the climate and biodiversity crises are intimately linked. They're also linked to unprecedented levels of economic inequality within our borders and between the global north and the south. And they share some of the same fundamental drivers, but also solutions. I think that where I want to start is by focusing on landscapes. To begin thinking about possible solutions, we need to recognize the fact that people are a part of landscapes. And have always been, and how people interact with nature and landscapes is deeply embedded in social relations, and how people interpret those landscapes, and their role in it, and their relationship with nature. So effective solutions to these problems require understanding that we need to shift human behavior and governance across landscapes in a way that harmonizes the needs of nature and people. In other words, we need to support the social, economic, and political conditions that enable us to preserve life on Earth. And this applies to nature-based solutions. As Mel mentioned, people are a part of nature-based solutions. There are actions driven by people within landscapes. And because landscapes are very heterogeneous, we say that these solutions are place-based. So for example, how effective a particular intervention is very much dependent on the ecological context, the social context, and the perspective of local stakeholders. So yes, we have to talk about people and nature when talking about nature-based solutions, as we emphasize it in our latest paper. Biodiversity and resilient ecosystems underpin effective nature-based solutions, as we know, and I'll focus on the role of people. The IUCN definition of nature-based solutions makes explicit that they are interventions or actions that are crucial to deliver human well-being, but it's important to make explicit the very point that the action is defined by people and activated by people with nature. So this is displayed in the figure that we published in the paper, People Working with Nature, which reflects this idea that the benefits we derive from nature are co-produced in many cases. And you know, in practice, this has many important implications. So perhaps you've heard by now, many of you have heard by now, the increasing emphasis on nature-based solutions to be locally led. The chair of the UK Environmental Agency, Emma Boyd, emphasized at the recent International Gavashona Conference in Bangladesh the need for locally led adaptation when talking about nature-based solutions. Giving as an example the River Otter realignment in the southwest of England. And the case I'm making is that this goes beyond successful adaptation. It's a hallmark of effective nature-based solutions, as the paper and the guidelines that are explained in the paper emphasize. These are the guidelines that Mel referred to earlier. So ensuring that solutions, yes, and the paper on the right here, this is another paper, I'm bringing some of those points home, highlighting how that's very much the case for carbon storage as well. So ensuring that solutions are locally led is not just ethical, but it also underpins the success of nature-based solutions. So the question is why that is, and why is it important to understand this, to reflect on how we think about nature-based solutions. So first, nature-based solutions cut across sectors and implicate multiple stakeholders who may have different priorities, interests, or values. And an example I like to share, because I did my first master's on the barn owl in Switzerland. An example I like to share is the one here in the top right image, which displays an intervention where Jordanian and Israeli farmers collaborate to control agricultural pests by protecting barn owls in the region. And so that's an example of how multi-stakeholder collaborations are really important. Barn owls do not recognize borders. And you know, it also means that an effective solution is one that really taps into people's motivations for it. And this can be tangible benefits, like protecting a shoreline from waves or storms. It could be material benefits, but it could also be relational or spiritual benefits. And often these are benefits that geographers refer to as sense of place. One great example in the image below is community-led ecosystem-based adaptation in the Peruvian Andes, where communities self-organize to implement ecosystem-based adaptation based on social norms, which are deeply rooted in Andean culture, values, beliefs, and traditions. So ecosystem-based adaptation is an example of a type of nature-based solution. And here's an example I like from the United States. Some of you may remember Hurricane Katrina. I hope most of you do, in 2005. But New Orleans was a city with old trees which were a key part of the local environment that people appreciated. They fostered a sense of place for local people and provided services like reducing urban heat. And when Hurricane Katrina hit, a lot of these trees were destroyed. They represented about all combined out of the 320 million large trees that were destroyed, it was about 385 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And people got back together to plant these trees, as the graph on the right shows. This is just an example from one area. The impacts, of course, were much wider. And as a result, people got back together to plant them. And that strengthened their social bonds. Implications for social justice and empowering local stakeholders is to ask whose knowledge defines the solution and determines its effectiveness. How a solution is framed on the ground influences what knowledge is used to design, manage, and monitor it. I may envision the problem in one way, but or its solution, but others may do so very differently. And the reason this is important is because not recognizing local perspectives and priorities can jeopardize the extent to which the solution gets local support and the extent to which it addresses the needs of local stakeholders. And the IUCN standard, which was released last year to inform the evaluation of nature-based solutions, emphasizes this in the very first point, that the identification of the challenge should be done through a transparent and inclusive consultation process. And this is also what we mean by our third guideline, which I mentioned before. Actions which don't mesh with the sociocultural fabrics can have serious pitfalls. In the photo on the right is an example from Portugal. There was a pulp and paper company which aimed to reforest 200 hectares of olive cultures with eucalyptus. This is in 1989 and 1990. The argument they had was that replacing small subsistence agriculture with monoculture plantations would yield higher profits at scale. And you can see that argument being played out right now on an international scale with respect to carbon, or at least arguments for carbon, where monoculture plantations are seen as a quick win. Here, the eucalyptus was also seen as a quick win, but the local villagers understood that it would lead to a lot of problems in a water-poor landscape. The villagers understood that short profits would yield losses in the medium term. So they grouped together and started uprooting the trees. So yes, I think that's an important example. There are many other examples, but yeah, the key thing is that it's really important to pay attention to local people. So that means that we need to ensure the solutions are defined with local stakeholders. Local communities and practitioners often have a rich knowledge of local ecosystems and their management. And this is based on adaptive learning. So incorporating this knowledge allows ensuring that the solution is effective and keeps pace with unpredictable change. And the very process of doing this fosters ownership of that solution, which therefore means the local stakeholders stand a better chance of being willing to protect it. And the other question is effective for whom? So who benefits and who loses? Because there are going to be trade-offs. You know, how are the benefits distributed, and how are the trade-offs distributed between stakeholders? We published an evidence map on nature-based solutions to climate change adaptation. And we found that a sizable proportion of the studies reported mixed social outcomes. And a lot of these were about trade-offs between different groups of stakeholders. rather than biophysical trade-offs, if you will. So that is, certain actors benefited, others lost. So there were a couple of cases in Kenya and Ethiopia, for instance, where some actors that were involved in the intervention benefited, but those that were not enrolled due to the way the government was governed had opportunity costs, and those it had to do with grazing rights, and that increased inequality, especially where gender and land tenure rights issues were already present. So the point is that we need to have social safeguards in place to mitigate or balance potential trade-offs. Trade-offs can compromise social outcomes and really jeopardize support for the intervention. So I want to go back to my first slide and to say that to address these challenges that we started talking about, including through nature-based solutions, we need to fully embrace, as practitioners, academics, and other decision makers, that finding the right solution entails working with a range of different stakeholders to design, implement, and learn through an iterative process. And transdisciplinary approaches, it might come across as a bit of an academic term, but in practice, a lot of us do that. It is about working with societal actors to find innovations that are effective and that can be taken up and scaled up. And the National Strategy for Flood and Coastal Erosion in the UK, for flood and coastal erosion risk management in the UK, for example, emphasizes the need to work with local communities. So we need partnerships to co-produce knowledge with academics, with practitioners, with local stakeholders. We also need horizontal partnerships between different actors within those landscapes, and we need partnerships across levels of decision making to ensure that policy addresses needs on the ground. And at the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, we have partnerships, which we refer to as communities of practice, with local organizations and practitioners and academics in Peru and Bangladesh. And you can find out more about that on our website. So that's it for now. I just want to end there and thank everybody for tuning in. And I want to thank the team I work with. So yeah, if I look forward to hearing your questions, and you'll see the two links here to our website. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Huge amount of food for thought there. And I'll confess I didn't know that as a result of Hurricane Katrina, there were 320 million large trees removed, I think you said, which is an extraordinary number. So thank you for that, and please do keep your questions coming in. We've had quite a few already. Please, we will try and get to all of them after we've heard from all the speakers. And our third speaker today is David Anderson. He's the warden in the south of Scotland for RSPB, and he's been the warden at RSPB Haugh for about the last year and a half. Before that, he worked on projects including the Inner Forth Futurescape and the Garnet Connections. So working at a landscape scale. A lot of his work has been focused on nature-based solutions to the challenges faced by climate change. He's worked on some managed realignment projects, and in his role at Haugh, he spent most of the past year developing the wetland regeneration project, which hopefully will deliver an exciting and sustainable future for the reserve, and will be the focus of his presentation. Now, David's talk has been pre-recorded, but and there is, for some, there might be a slight time delay between the slides, so it's please don't adjust your sets, as they say. But he is with us today and will be able to answer questions. So if you've got any questions from the presentation, do please pop them in the chat bar, as folk have started to do already. So I think David is going to say hello, and then Tammy will run the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Thanks very much for that. I had obviously hoped to do this presentation live, but just unfortunately with many people, childcare stuff, you have to kind of balance these things out. So I've got a little toddler running around. So we thought best just to record a presentation so you can hear it all in one, and then I'll be there to answer questions as well. So I'm just going to try and play it. Tammy, give me a nod here. I'm just going to play it off my screen. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. So I'm actually going to mute myself and share the system's sound so you're not hearing me read stories. Hi everyone, thanks very much for inviting me here to this webinar to do this talk. My name is David, I am the Warden for RSPB Barons Haugh, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the wetland regeneration project that we are just beginning at the reserve, which is a project which will help us adapt to climate change through nature and deliver a fantastic nature reserve for people as well. So I never need a second invitation to talk about Barons Haugh. I think it's an absolute gem of a reserve right in the heart of central Scotland. Fantastic wildlife, loved by people, and a really interesting site, especially when you're looking at nature-based solutions. And that really brings me to the key message for my talk today, and that is that Barons Haugh is the perfect place to demonstrate the potential of nature-based solutions. Hopefully by the end of this talk you will agree with me on that point, and I hope to demonstrate that through the rest of what I'm going to be talking about today. So just to briefly go through what I will be talking about over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to start with why I believe Barons Haugh is the perfect place for looking at nature-based solutions. And then I'm going to talk specifically about the challenges that climate change is presenting us at this reserve, before going on to looking at how we are delivering a climate-ready future at Barons Haugh by meeting these challenges and creating a sustainable future for the reserve. And then at the end we'll have a question and answer session where hopefully the very glamorous live version of myself will be able to answer any questions that you do have. So first of all, I'm going to go and look at why I think Barons Haugh is the perfect place to demonstrate the value of nature-based solutions to climate change. I wanted to by just giving you the context of where Barons Haugh is for those that maybe do not know the reserve. So it's right in the heart of central Scotland, to the southeast of Glasgow. So on this map you can see Glasgow in the northwest, and then the reserve highlighted in red. So you can see right between motorways, and then basically right in the middle of a conurbation, really. And just to zoom down a little bit further, these are some aerial shots of the reserve. So the red line is the boundary of the reserve, and if you look at that red line on the southern boundary, that's following the course of the River Clyde. And a large part of the reserve is actually what would have been the floodplain for the River Clyde. So that area to the north of the river is part of the floodplain, and of course the area to the south of the river is part of the floodplain as well. So that's how it would be in its natural state. However, the reserve has had a very interesting history that has really changed how that land functions. Going back to really the early part of the 20th century, you can see in this old map that there are quite significant mine workings up the north part of it, and down the bottom you can see by that stage bunds had been created around that part of the floodplain to drain the land and make it suitable for grazing, and that's really how it was used for 150-200 years. Just moving on a little bit in time into the early 1950s, this is an old overhead photograph of the reserve. Down the bottom, you can see Dale Estate, which is the designed landscape, and that's also part of the reserve. But up the top part of that picture, you can see a large pool starting to form. Now that pool formed through mining subsidence, creating this kind of wetland pool behind that bund which had been created. So it was at that point the land stopped really being used as it was for grazing. The mining stopped as well, and it was then in 1983 that RSPB bought the reserve to manage it as a nature reserve, because after that pool had been formed, lots of fantastic birds started using the site, and it was somewhere that we really wanted to protect from nature and make a special place for local people as well. So nowadays it's a terrific little nature reserve and a very special place for wildlife. We currently manage the wetland area through a sluice that we have in the bund, which allows us to lower the water during the autumn winter to attract in passage and migrating waders and wintering wildfowl, and then we raise the water up again during the summer, spring and summer, to provide for breeding wildfowl as well. And it's a great place for wildlife. During the autumn, we get some fantastic waders coming in. Godwit, green shank, red shank, as in the picture there, and then we also have a brilliant array of wildfowl such as gadwall and widgeon and teal, so a huge range of species. The other really fantastic thing about this reserve is the fact that so many people love it and so many people use this reserve. We estimate that we get around 40,000 visitors a year utilising the reserve, and we've only just managed to get these figures through putting in people counters at different points to give us an estimation of that figure, and it's certainly been a very popular reserve for local people to get out and about during the pandemic that's happened over the past year when they could only use local sites. And the other interesting fact about this is the fact that the potential audience for the reserve is quite huge. If you were to put a pin in the middle of Barons Haugh and then draw a circle with a radius of say 10 miles around the reserve, so within quite easy access for people, then we find we have over 600,000 people living in that area. So that is a really significant audience. Adding to that the fact that there's easy transport links through motorways and train stations right next to the reserve, it makes it a really unique location for a nature reserve of this kind. And that also means it's a great place for decision makers to come and see the benefits of things like nature-based solutions to climate change. So all these things put together really make it that perfect place to demonstrate the potential of nature. Of course, the other thing we need to demonstrate that potential is climate change related issues, and I can guarantee we have those at Barons Haugh as well. So this is a video of the River Clyde going past the western part of the reserve, and this is from the winter of last year. So you can see how high the water levels were at that point, and trust me, the water levels got even higher than that, and the power and the amount of water that is coming down the river at that stage is quite significant. On the map on the right, you can see the yellow dot indicates where that video was taken from. So what you can see there is you've got quite a large natural meander coming around the river, and then it's coming straight against the artificial structure, which is the bund. So you've got the river doing what it's wanting and doing, coming up against the artificial bund that has been created by humans. And with climate change causing more regular flood events and more water basically coming down during those flood events, this is starting to cause us some quite significant issues at the reserve. So that's what we want to come on to next in this part of the presentation. That is the challenges that we are facing from climate change. So I'm going to start with this picture. You can see up the top left there, this picture shows you the extent of one of our floods from about 4 years ago. If you look carefully in that picture, you can see there's kind of a green strip going across between the trees and the water there. That's actually the roof of one of our bird hides, and those things are 7-8 foot tall, so they're pretty high, so it gives you an idea of how high the water is. And you can see in the map below again that yellow dot shows where that hide was, so you can see the amount of water moving over the reserve, and that yellow dot indicates just about where the water was getting up to during that flood. Now, in the past, we were seeing maybe a flood like that once every 3 years. I started as warden at the reserve in June of 2019. I saw my first flood of that extent that August. Then I saw it again in December, and then through January to March, basically the whole Haugh was flooded. So we are seeing these floods happen with increased regularity, certainly at least once a year, probably more than once a year, and quite often staying flooded for a significant length of time. Just to really show you how much water is coming into the reserve from the River Clyde, this is what the reserve looks like at a relatively dry time. As you can see, you've got that pool created by the mining subsidence, but you can see beyond that quite a large area of wet grassland as well. But when we get a flood, as we did last year, the reserve looks like this. So this is a photo taken last February, actually just before the lockdown. And the reserve looked like this from January right through to the middle of March. So obviously that really impacts on what we can actually do on the reserve. And it also means the kind of management I talked about earlier on in the presentation of lowering the water levels and raising the water levels doesn't really have any effect, because this flood happened when we were trying to have the water levels low for wintering waders, and you can see that the water is anything but low. So really management is not really having an effect when this is happening more and more often. So there are significant issues occurring through this flooding. One of the most significant issues is the erosion of a footpath, which is really well used by people who visit the reserve. Now, these photographs aren't great for comparison, it's taken in slightly different areas, but if you look at the photograph on the left, that was taken in December of 2019, and you can see the white lines that were painted on the path there. Those were painted in March of that year when the erosion got just to the edge of the path. And by the time I started, you can see that the erosion started eating into the path there and taking away some of the areas of the path where those white lines have been painted. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see that those white lines are no longer apparent and the erosion has gone all the way over the other side of the path. That happened over the course of about 6 months. So you can see how quickly that bank is starting to erode, and that's right along the edge of the bund. So with more flood events and increased ferocity of these flood events, we can see that erosion start to accelerate. So that's obviously a significant problem for people who want to access the reserve, and also what the river is trying to do to try and basically get in to the reserve through the bund. And just for context, this is a picture of that area of the bank about 5 years ago, slightly further up the path. And this was the very first area of real erosion we got coming right in towards the existing path. Since then, that has obviously increased massively to the fact that we've now lost much of the path. So we're getting real pressure from outside pushing into the reserve, taking away some of access routes. But there's also the issue when the water comes into the reserve and what it wants to do then. And I think this can be demonstrated from my next video. So this is a video of the aftermath of a flood event, basically. What happened, water comes and floods into the reserve, then the water drops in the river, there's still some water held in the reserve, and it has to try and find its way out. So what happens is it breaches the bund and it flows back out into the river. So we've had a few of these breaches happen in different spots. You can see in the map on the right hand side there, that yellow dot indicating where that breach happened. So it's causing damage to the infrastructure of the reserve. Damage which of course we are having to repair, and we're having to do constant repairs. Really, this was from a couple of years ago when we tried to repair where that breach was, put in these gaming baskets, repair the path, try to basically patch it up. but then a next big flood event that comes a couple of years later, the power of that increasing blows all that out again. So really, it's starting to feel like we had a little boy putting his finger in the holes of the dam. This is not really a sustainable way to be managing the reserve anymore because of the increasing frequency of these floods. What it's doing to the reserve and what it's doing to the access means that how we are managing it currently is probably not sustainable going into the long term. We'd be constantly chasing a tail. So we've really got to think a little bit differently and think how we can work with what the river wants to do and what nature wants to do to help us deal with the changes that climate change is bringing. So just to recap the challenges we're facing, there's significant increase in frequency and ferocity of flood events is causing erosion to our access routes. It's having impacts on the habitat, changing how we can manage reserve, meaning some of the management actions are not having the effect that we want them to have. And of course, there's an uncertain future for the reserve if we keep managing it that way. So we need to look a little bit differently. So that brings me on to the final part of my presentation, what we are doing to deliver a climate-ready future for RSPB Barons Haugh. Now, I'd love to be able to stand here and show you exactly what we've done to deal with all these challenges. Unfortunately, we're not at that stage yet. We're really right at the very beginning of mapping out a new future for the reserve. And one of the first things we've got to do is we've really got to understand the processes that are happening around Barons Haugh. What's happening during the floods, where the water's going, what the water's doing, and what potential options that gives us. So we really need to build up our understanding of everything that's going on before we take the next steps and actually do things on the ground. Because we all know where it gets us if we act without evidence. We're not flat earthers. We want to make sure that we're following the data that we have to make sure we make an informed choice about what we do at Barons Haugh. And that's why we have developed the Wetland Regeneration Project. This project has been developed over the past year. One of the good things about the pandemic, I suppose, is that it's given me more time to kind of work on projects looking a bit longer term rather than the often kind of short term things you have to do as warden of a reserve. The Wetland Regeneration Project is a long-term project looking at how we tackle the issues we're facing at Barons Haugh, and it's got three stages. The first of these stages is the option appraisal and design. So looking at what our options are to tackle these challenges that climate change is bringing us and doing a full design of the best option to tackle it. And I'm pleased to say we're right at the start now of that options appraisal stage. We've got consultants in working with us to develop these options and do all the modelling we need to understand the site fully. So it's really exciting to be at that stage. Now, after we've done that, chosen the best option and got a design, we then move over onto a groundwork phase, possibly in a couple of years' time, to actually implement those changes on the ground. And then, of course, we need access and interpretation with that. There's no point in us doing this without considering the people that use the site and live around the site and what they want from the site as well. So we make sure we incorporate that all the way through the project as well. Of course, I'd be lying if I was saying I have no idea what we might want in the reserve. We're looking at our options, trying to get data together, but we are starting to gain an understanding of what we think we might want to see at Barons Haugh in the future. Now, I'm never a great fan when someone during a presentation goes, the dictionary definition of such and such is such and such. However, the dictionary definition of Haugh is a stretch of alluvial land forming part of the river valley. So from the name of the reserve, we know what it wants to be. It wants to be a floodplain. So renaturalising that area is clearly something we have to be seriously considering and seems like a good option for us going forward. Of course, it's only one of a series of options we'll be considering, but if we're looking at how to tackle this in a sustainable manner and use nature to help us deal with the issues that climate change is throwing up, renaturalising that floodplain seems like a good road to go down. Now, there's a lot of steps before we go towards that, but we can foresee that would create exciting habitat, create fantastic flood storage benefits for downstream, and would be an exciting place for people to see as well. So there's exciting options there for the future that we could take forward. One of the key factors about this project, however, is the fact that RSPB Barons Haugh really is part of the community. One of my favourite views of the reserve is when you're standing down by the wetland and you look up and you can see the tall blocks of Motherwell literally just surrounding the reserve. So people are really living on top of this nature reserve, and we need to make sure we bring them with us along this journey about what we're doing for the future of Barons Haugh. We've already started engaging with local groups who care and love the reserve. We're going to continue to do that through the process, both on reserve and in the community. If we waited till basically we knew exactly what we were going to do and we're starting to do that work, it would be too late. We need to bring people on this journey with us to allow them to understand what we're doing and understand how we are using the natural benefits of the reserve to deal with the impacts that climate change is having on us. And that really brings me back to the key messages for my presentation today. And I hope that I've shown you that Barons Haugh really is the perfect place to demonstrate nature-based solutions. We've got significant issues from climate change. We've got an exciting project that I believe will create an exciting future for the reserve, and is a perfect place to demonstrate those options to local people and to decision makers. So that is the end of my talk today. I'm really privileged to work at Barons Haugh. I'm really privileged to be involved in this project, and I do foresee a really exciting future for the reserve, and hope you'll all come and visit one day. Thank you very much. Sorry, thanks everyone. Sorry I couldn't do that live, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be here for questions as much as I can.
Well, thank you, David. And I think no Zoom event is complete without being Zoom bombed by a toddler at the moment, or a cat. It's pretty much compulsory. And thank you for giving us your time when I know you're doing a lot of childcare. So thank you everybody for your contributions. It's been much appreciated. With complete chair's privilege, I would encourage you to go and visit Barons Haugh if and when travel restrictions allow, because it's also one of the best places to see otters that I've been in close proximity to Glasgow. And now it's over to you. We've had a number of questions coming in. So thank you for those, and I think I'll probably just take them in turn. So the first question we've had is from Ruby Temple Long, and it's specifically to Mel, saying, could you tell us a bit more about why it's important to implement nature-based solutions across all ecosystems on land, at the coast and at sea? And perhaps related to that, there's a question also from Barbara asking about if you could say a little bit more about how wetlands store more carbon than rainforests.
Yes, of course, really happy to answer those questions. I think they're both really good questions. So to say a little bit more about that. So obviously woodlands and forests do play a really critical role in locking up carbon. You can see that in the above ground vegetation. But what's often ignored in kind of policy making decisions is the below ground stuff. So because peatlands play such a significant role in storing very, very large amounts of carbon, they obviously are a really important ecosystem to take into account. Now, as I mentioned in my presentation, at the moment they're in really bad condition. They're leaching very large amounts of carbon, and we need to stop that emission source. So focusing on peatlands, restoring them, re-wetting them, stopping burning, stopping draining them is really, really important. So they have that important role to play. And often people don't think about the role that the coastal wetlands play. Yeah, my statistic around 2 to 4 times tropical rainforests. So that's not actually the carbon that they store. Clearly, tropical rainforests have a huge amount of above ground carbon. That's actually, the statistic relates to the rate at which they lock up carbon. So unlike other ecosystems, which when the vegetation decomposes, that goes back into the carbon goes back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or methane, when marshland plants die, rather than decomposing and releasing their carbon into the atmosphere, they actually become buried by mud. So as you can imagine, the sea is coming in and it's washing sediment layers over those tidal marshes and burying that carbon-rich material. And as that continues to work, actually they become very, very important and effective carbon sinks. And the same is actually true, I think even more rapid rates of sequestration actually take place in kelp beds and seagrasses. And I mentioned that there's emerging evidence and a greater understanding coming about those. And those are all really important marine habitats, but they can also sequester carbon at a phenomenal rate. And the reason why all of these ecosystems are so important is because, you know, the climate crisis is incredibly challenging. You know, we have to try and keep levels, we have to keep levels of warming below 1.5 degrees to stay within climate safe limits, but we're already, you know, over 1 degree. I think I heard recently we're approaching 1.3 degrees. So we need to throw everything that we have at the climate change problem. And of course, a huge proportion of that effort is going to be decarbonisation of our economies and fossil fuel reduction, but we also need every element of sequestration that ecosystems can provide for the climate crisis, but obviously also because that has such benefits for nature. Have I covered both of those questions now?
I think so, but I'll wait and see if we get any feedback from the 2 question answers. But while they're askers, but while they're contemplating that, I think that kind of every tool in the toolkit needs to be used approach maybe relates to the next question, also for you, Mel, which is coming from Fiona Dobson, saying, could you give us a top line summary of the most important things that need to happen in the run up to and at COP26 to robustly raise the role of nature in tackling the climate crisis and prevent greenwashing like was emerging at COP25?
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Yeah, a really good question. So in the context of everything we've heard today, what policy decisions have to be taken by decision makers, and particularly using these important decision-making events as hooks? I think I'll start by saying what we need to do as the UK, which has the presidency of the COP, to lead by example. So the UK will be under a lot of scrutiny in an unprecedented way in terms of how we manage our own climate emissions. So from the nature perspective, I'm delighted that nature is a theme of COP26. So people will be looking at what we're doing in the UK. And we have, of course, with Brexit, left the common agricultural policy. So we have the opportunity to shape a new land use system. And the one that is being brought forward is paying public money for public goods. And it's actually paying landowners to invest in climate protection through their land management and in biodiversity protection. So how well those new land management schemes across the different countries of the UK are operating will be really critical in showing how to the global audience how effective the UK is at utilising its land sector for carbon sequestration. And on the nature conservation side, likewise, the Prime Minister signed up to the 30 by 30 pledge that we protect 30% of our land area by 2030. And bringing into that, the UK is looking at sites of special scientific interest, national parks, AONBs, but a lot of those are not in good condition. And I highlighted how our peatland sites are not in good condition and leaching lots of carbon. A lot of those are not in good condition for nature and thereby not maximising their potential for carbon storage. So we need to be showcasing really good practice in the UK. And, you know, from an England perspective, that means stopping burning our blanket bogs. That feels like an obvious policy step. Looking more internationally, at a major UN summit last year, the UK launched with other high ambition countries the Leaders Pledge for Nature, which set out what countries can and should be doing to deliver across nature protection and climate across globally. That provides kind of momentum and focus for some of these discussions and can lead up to some really good outcomes from the COP itself. Now, there's a challenge at the COP in that nature isn't actually explicitly being discussed. So the valuable role that nature plays needs to be reflected into the COP decision text. And in Madrid at COP25, we got some good text in there, but it's it was very small. We need to build on that and have all of those 192 governments represented in that decision-making process, reflecting on the importance of nature and putting in place mechanisms for that conversation to come to the table, because it's not actively being discussed. There's actually some really good text around the role of nature in the Paris Agreement itself, but it's not currently being negotiated. The last thing I'll say is that one thing that is being negotiated is the role of carbon markets. And it's very contentious around whether or not there are opportunities for land and nature being brought into those carbon markets or not. Some people see the risks from offsetting being too risky, too significant. And, you know, when we see the likes of Shell and BP coming forward and proposing, you know, to continue their businesses as usual activities and doing that greenwashing through tree planting schemes, you can see why people have those risks. Why people are aware of those risks. Others are arguing that the only way to get sufficient investment in nature is to bring private sector money to the table. So we need to kind of find our way through that, and any role for nature and role for nature in those carbon markets needs to be accompanied by very strict safeguards and guardrails for investors, so that they're not investing in the wrong kind of outcomes.
Brilliant, very comprehensive answer, Mel. The two things I would just pick up to say to folk: the Scottish Government's also signed up by the 30% protected by 2030, but I think we're really lagging behind in terms of looking at land management payments, particularly the role and importance of climate, but particularly biodiversity in those. We are not making fast progress, I don't think. So if I could move on to the next question that came in from Isabel Mercer, which is for Alex. Thanks for a great presentation, really interesting case studies. At a global scale, could you point to any particular organisations, institutions, or countries who are really leading the way in delivering nature-based solutions in this way, bringing along and benefiting local communities, groups, or stakeholders?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll start by saying that at a global scale, initiatives are led at a variety of different scales. So what I mean by that is some are led by local communities directly, some by regional organizations, national organizations. In the UK, we've talked about how the good work RSPB is doing in restoring peatlands. So there is such a wide range of organizations. If we look at, I guess this is an opportunity for me to guide you to our website, which I'll post in the chat, which has a list under the practice banner. You can view a list of case studies from around the world. So, for example, the Philippines, Peru, and the Netherlands and Nepal, that have a very strong community focused. One specific example from Peru is the organization called the Mountain Institute, the Instituto de Montaña, which develops very comprehensive community-based projects designed to harmonize livelihoods and nature conservation. And another example, which you might have heard on some other panels, is from the Sahel in Africa. The African Union is supporting an initiative called the Great Green Wall, which is about restoring the dry lands, and it covers a massive landscape from east to west in the Sahel, harnessing local traditional practices, also with very much a livelihoods focus. Obviously, in poor countries, people are very dependent on nature for their livelihoods. So hence the focus on livelihoods. And there's an important component focusing on climate change adaptation. So the Great Green Wall is a kind of like a mosaic of activities around sustainable land management and restoration. Also, CIFOR, I should mention, which works a lot on farmer-centered restoration options to be implemented across very large areas. We have also ICRAF, the International Center for Agroforestry, and Susan Chamba, who speaks on many panels, mentioned that you know, in relation to her experience and the initiatives they're leading, that, you know, restoration is about people. You can't just plant trees with drones and expect them to grow and restore landscapes. And then you might have heard, the last thing I'll mention is governments have a massive role to play. In the United States, this is an anecdote from the US, which I don't know if many people know about, but there's a very prominent agricultural extension service, which has a program on conservation agriculture. And I think it's significantly underfunded, but it has a lot of potential and has done a lot, which promotes sustainable, resilient agroecological practices, some of which incorporate agroforestry. And on that point, healthy biodiverse agricultural soils are absolutely essential to store carbon. And there was a movie or a documentary that was released recently called Kissing the Ground, which highlights the work that the Extension Service does. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, but there's such a diverse range of organizations.
It's great, Alex, and I must admit it's enormously heartening when asked for good examples to be able to provide them. There is nothing more depressing than talking about something important and not being able to point to any good practice. So that's really invaluable. And I know you'll we'll share some links with people in the chat if that's not already happened. So there's 3 questions here, all for David. So I'll maybe bundle them together. David, they are essentially around, you know, whether beavers are an option upstream in the Clyde, which I think probably links quite closely to what kind of engagement is happening or being considered with other stakeholders who are using these areas or invested in those areas. And also maybe saying a little bit as a question about, you know, are there wider socioeconomic benefits to having, to doing what you're talking about that can tackle other problems such as mental health? And those are from Paul Duffy, Andrew Stark and Miles.
Yeah, great questions. Thanks very much. So I'll try and sort of, as the question bundle together, try and bundle answers together. First of all, just starting from the bottom there is the kind of socio-economic benefits of it. I think that's actually quite key. Sorry, I might be interrupted a little bit here, I apologise, but it's quite a key part of what we're trying to do. I mean, the Irish Haugh is never going to be a reserve, or hasn't been a reserve where we've had like really key breeding species, partly because of location and things of predation is a big issue, you know, in that kind of urban environment and things like that. So having those other benefits, such as what it can do in terms of nature-based solutions for climate change, and other benefits in terms of education and engagement with kind of different groups. So it's in a very socially deprived area as well, with lots of skills. Or sorry, excuse me a second. I apologize. I'm going to pick it up and try and catch.
Yeah, of course. The joys of multitasking. Oh, great. We've got a feature speaker now, an unbilled feature speaker. Do we get introduced?
Well, sorry, this is Aoife. She's 16 months. So I'm afraid I couldn't leave in front of a TV yet, but she might be quiet if I just hold her. So I'm sorry, but so we've got things like lots of schools and stuff around the reserve, and what we were trying to do, certainly before the pandemic, was we wanted to go and do co-design workshops with them. So talk about climate change, talk about what we're trying to achieve in the area, and get them to actually work with us to almost design areas of the reserve that we could then work with them to take forward. And I think that's where Barron's Haugh is key influence, that it can get easily accessible to these schools, and they can really take an active part in what we're trying to do. And yes, things like, I mean, as a one, I would love beavers at reserve. You know, we know they're ecological engineers, and it would be a great feature to attract people in and get people talking about the wider issues of wetland management and climate change management. I'm probably going to stop there. I'm sorry.
David, I have to say, you know, we normally ask for feedback after these kind of events, and I'm just going to manage the expectation of every other speaker and tell you that Aoife is going to have completely stolen the show. So thank you for valiant effort. There are a couple of other questions that have come in. One from Erica, which is, how can we collaborate with local populations in the care and advocacy for important sites for nature and climate? And I think I'll open that up to both Alex and Mel. Do you know who'd like to come in first? Alex, are you?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I did hear that. Could you repeat the question, please?
Of course, is how can we collaborate with local populations in the care and advocacy for important sites for nature and climate?
That's a fantastic question, how to collaborate. I think that's what I was trying to I didn't have time to get into detail, but that's kind of what I was trying to talk about in terms of the transdisciplinary approach. The first step is talking to local communities, finding out what their needs and concerns are. It's about relationship building. It's about focusing on them as much as you focus on your own priorities. And conservation organizations have a tremendous amount of experience in doing that. So yeah, I think spending time and allowing for that time in the projects that we design, or in the research work that we do. There is, I think, communication experts can help a lot in that role, to foster relationship building. But how you go about doing it, I think, really depends on what the issue is, what the challenge is, where you are, what the context is, and so forth. But at least, yeah, I hope that gives some insights into how to go about this.
Thanks, Alex. I'll come to Mel in a moment about the question from Jill Matthews on the football pitches, but just a sort of quick reflection myself on the collaboration, which is, I think, particularly in Scotland at the moment with the Scottish Land Commission and the emphasis on land managers and landowners being far more open and transparent about plans and proposals, about talking to communities and communities of interest. I think there's quite a significant shift happening within Scotland around just around this subject, and I think it's to be welcomed. There's the Scottish Land Commission Rights and Responsibilities Statement, which is setting out for land managers what might be considered good practice, and certainly RSPB Scotland are keen to comply with that and review all of the stuff we do already. And I think one of the other really interesting things over the last 11 months has been that I come from a planning background. I've spent probably more time than is sensible sitting in drafty village halls, trying to consult or engage with what is meant to be the local community, and it's never been a wildly satisfactory experience. I think one of the really interesting things about recent experience has been that the online world certainly provides more opportunities to talk to more people and more diverse people, and some of the rewards from that have been quite great. So I'd like, certainly as organisationally, I'd like us to capture some of that and do more of it. And our last question, I think, is probably going to have to be our last question for today. It was from Jill Matthews, which is, for decades, conservationists have used football pitches to describe how the rate of loss of habitats. And I have to say, I agree with you, Jill, it's not a metric that particularly works for me. Don't we need an equivalent for a tonne of CO2, both for carbon stores and carbon sequestration? And perhaps the price of a tonne of carbon could then be described in those terms. Mel, are you happy to pick that up?
Yeah, I'll have a go. I think I can answer part of the question. So we often look at the equivalents to cars, the emissions from cars. So in RSPB's own analysis around the potential for UK ecosystems to store carbon, we found that the UK's peatlands, woodlands and grasslands lock up more than 16 billion tonnes of CO2, which is more than 130 years worth of the current emissions of all the cars, vans and lorries on our roads. So I think that goes some way to kind of painting a picture of what those kind of emissions equate to in a way that that kind of football pitch analogy tries to do. But in terms of, that's generally numbers that are hard to envisage. I have posted in the chat a link to an American site. Actually, it's from the US Environment Protection Agency, which actually has a greenhouse gas equivalencies calculator. So you can compare these large CO2 figures to things like cars, but also other metrics as well, which I found useful in the past. Bear in mind, it is a US, not a UK one. I don't think we have a UK equivalent, but that's kind of helpful. So if anyone has better suggestions than cars, I'd be really interested in hearing it, but at least that provides some kind of metric for carbon. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel, that's really helpful. I think the trying to make it tangible and real for people is absolutely the question. How do we make this something people can quantify and hold in their own minds? But I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring our session to a close. Thank you for joining us. A huge and particular thanks to our speakers for their time and for answering all your questions. I'll confess, I mean, this is a subject I thought I knew reasonably well, but in preparing for today and thinking about today, I did a bit of reading around the subject, and I think the sensitivities, the need to do this well, the need to consider what is being done, how it's being done, and who it's being done with, has been really driven home by the presentations today. I'd also like to say a really big thank you to the Stop Climate Chaos team, particularly Tammy for managing today so smoothly, and to Lottie from RSPB for helping to pull the whole session together. What I will do is finish with, again, a probably not wildly gentle reminder that the Climate Fringe website is a fantastic place to go to. There are loads of other events on it that are going on across the climate movement from now until COP26, an Edinburgh Fringe for the climate, if you will. A huge thank you to everyone who joined the event today for all of your questions. We're going to follow up those who registered for the event with an email, and there'll be a link to the recording of the session if there's anything you want to look at again, or obviously feel free to share far and wide, because I think the more of us who understand and want to see the right thing being done for both nature and climate, the greater the probability that we will actually be able to achieve it. So thank you very much for your time today, and please do join us at a future session. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Speakers and organisers, stay on if you can for 5 minutes afterwards, just for a bit of a chat.
Of course, Kat.